All right, recording is started, and this is the January 9th, 2025 Crossplane community meeting. This is the first community meeting of the year, so happy New Year to everybody. Hope folks got some time maybe over the holidays to relax and recharge a little bit. But we're back at it, and we've got a big milestone we're working towards with about a month or so left. So lots of stuff to get back and caught up on and get moving on. So let's dive into the agenda. It has not been a full month since the last time that we met together because the December community meeting was pushed back a little bit with conflicts. So not a whole lot of new topics since the last community meeting, but there definitely is a big topic at the end that Nick will be taking us through and talking about some future vision and direction of Crossplane that's, I think, quite exciting. So lots of interesting things to do there. So we'll save a fair chunk of time for that, I think. So let's get started on the typical topics first. All right, so we did not do any patch releases or anything for Crossplane or Crossplane runtime that I know of since the last community meeting. I think we did one like the day of or the day before the last community meeting, but no new releases over the holidays to talk about. The next release that we are working towards, that milestone, is the 1.19 release. We on the calendar, on the community calendar, it's scheduled for early February. I haven't seen any major reasons to be pushing that I know of for now, so it seems to be holding fairly steady. Obviously, if there's a quality related thing or something very impactful that we need to make a change for, we will do that. But I think I don't have any awareness of that needing to change yet. And Mark will be our release manager, as mentioned last time. So thanks, Mark, for that. Let's instead of looking at all the release board and every the issues on there, let's look at actually kind of just high level some of the bigger things that are in flight right now. So I think we mentioned this last time that the usage API has been promoted to beta. So you can expect to have that as part of the 1.19 milestone there. So thanks, Hassan, for continuing to drive and mature that to the beta milestone there. That also brings up something interesting. I swear we had talked about this last time, but it was not on the agenda for last time. So I am going to mention it again right now. And sorry for this is a duplicate. But with a lot of the work we're doing and continuing to mature Crossplane APIs, usage API is one of them. Environment configs was one from 1.18. We have noticed that we have continuously got it wrong to correctly mature our APIs across various versions and doing all the dance that you need to do to update CRDs and their storage versions and their served versions and all that sort of stuff. So it's time to get that straightened out and make sure that we don't make the same mistake again. Basically, in 1.18, I think it was 1.18, we if you went to 1.18, you could not downgrade back to 1.17 because of the CRD storage versions not being managed appropriately. So we've got that defined here in terms of over a number of versions. How do you mature an API in Crossplane? How do you bump the storage version and the served versions and then eventually drop old versions entirely once everything's been migrated? So I think this plan looks pretty good. We've got a couple eyes on it. I don't see any major difficulties with it. And I'm in the process right now of writing this down in the contributing guide, and then also having some testing and some updates to the code base to make this more easy as well. So I wanted to mention that because we're maturing lots of APIs and we should not get this wrong again. I think that being able to not downgrade is bitten us a couple times, and we should not do that again. A couple other big things in flight right now in the 1.19 milestone is I know Ezgi has a design out that I think has not yet been merged, if I'm correct on that, right? That's still open. For being able, in 1.18, we added the ability to automatically manage dependencies and upgrade dependencies for you over time instead of going stale like they've done for years and years in Crossplane. This would add new functionality to also, if the scenario and version constraints call for it, to automatically downgrade a dependency as well. That would be a opt-in feature flag sort of thing. But if you're interested in that functionality, do check out that design. Server-side apply has been baking for a few milestones now, and that looks to be pretty stable and pretty steady. So good work for, I think it was Nick and Predrag that did some initial work on that, and it looks pretty good. And so we are expecting to mature that to beta. Obviously that is very related to the API promotion process we were just talking about, so we don't want to get that wrong. We've also made some progress on our end-to-end test reliability. If you've submitted a PR to Crossplane, you've probably seen a lot of red X's for your end-to-end tests. So we've made a couple updates and fixes there that we're hoping to stabilize a bit, but I think that'll be an ongoing effort to continue maturing and making sure that we're driving to very stable and lack of flakiness in our tests. Yeah, I think this is actually the same thing as this one. And another stretch goal we have here, we're not committing to this one, but we do also hope to continue maturing real-time compositions. We know folks really like that feature. It's been highly used, but it does have some bugs with it that are making it difficult to use. So those are going to be challenging to debug and get correct, but we're hoping to spend some time on that as well. Was there other stuff in 1.19 that folks wanted to bring up before we move on? All right. If nothing else for 1.19. Oh, I think I see a hand up. Yes.
Yeah, I just heard about the not able to downgrade. Is this like 1.18 not able to downgrade to any version that's below 1.18?
Yes, that was the case, and I think we fixed it in 1.18.2. So if you're on 1.18.2, I think you then now have you've restored the ability to downgrade to 1.17 and before again.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yep, yeah, no worries. All right, so yeah, so there's still some, and then as always, there's always some links in here for folks. Oh, and actually, I think I forgot to drop a link to the agenda doc in the chat like I typically do, so I'm gonna do that right now. Sorry about that. But yeah, there's links in the agenda doc here for unassigned issues that are useful and helpful. So if folks want to get involved, contributions, there's some opportunities there. Okay, let's move on to providers. Then a whole bunch of updates in here. Fatih, are you on the call to walk through those? No, looks like not. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and grab that. So yeah, we have specific links to a bunch of different provider updates and new releases and versions. So you check out the release notes for some of the details there. There's also summaries included in here as well. A number of these are associated with recently discovered Golang security vulnerabilities and various dependencies with our Go libraries. So we're staying on top of those, and if when vulnerabilities are discovered in our dependencies, go ahead and get new versions published out for those so that we can stay ahead of those. So then that's mostly what most of the provider updates are right now, or the recent ones since the holidays, that is. Also, some recent investments in the Upjet framework itself. Looks like Steve, I think you were on the call. You had one of these as well, so that's called out here for upgrading the Crossplane runtime recently within Upjet. So thanks for doing that, Steve. And reminder, as always, that there is a special interest group around Upjet. So if folks want to join those, there's a specific agenda and Slack channel, and you can dive even deeper into Upjet related things, a provider related feature areas, and be a part of that. So thanks for folks doing that too. Anything else to call out about providers at this time? Then we have an agenda item for later as well. Anything else now? All right, cool. All right, so let's move on to the bigger topics here, the broader topics. As always, we have some cool content recently. A number of folks have written some blog posts, and it looks like there's some training courses around Crossplane as well, which seems pretty cool. Victor has a pretty neat little video that's taking a look at some other projects coming up in the landscape, and comparing that functionality. Which is pretty interesting. So that's a pretty interesting video. You can check that one out. Thanks, Victor, for putting that together. And if folks have other interesting content, blog posts, videos, all that stuff, feel free to drop them as suggestions in the agenda doc here, and we'll include those in too. I gave an update last time for the graduation with the CNCF that we met with our TOC sponsor. Karina is our sponsor. We did our kickoff meeting. So the due diligence period has started. She is doing adopter interviews as well with some of the Crossplane adopters that want to share their stories. So I think that's all ongoing right now, and there's nothing pending for us to do or follow up on as far as I know. But we are in the thick of the due diligence, and we are definitely excited to finish that up, get approval, and get to the finish line with this over the next couple of months. So yeah, thanks everybody who is an adopter who is sharing their story and doing interviews with the technical oversight committee. All right, last thing from me before I hand it off to some other folks is I did want to share. There's a new GitHub action from the community here that it's hosted in the Crossplane contrib repo, and it's basically a reusable GitHub action that you can use to set up the Crossplane CLI, install the CLI, and get it cached for subsequent runs as well, so that if you have pipeline steps in your GitHub actions that want to use Crossplane CLI functionality, it's an easy way and repeatable way to get it installed and ready to run, so that your GitHub actions can use Crossplane functionality. So check that out if you have any needs for that. I think there's some examples in that repo as well. All right, Jean, do you want to go ahead and take over for your section here? Do you want to share your screen too, or?
No, I'm just gonna verbalize it a little bit there. So, in November last year, Upbound made an announcement that we are making some investments into our providers to meet some of the needs of our enterprise customers. So we invested quite a bit of effort into the security practices around CVEs, as well as some good industry best practices. And as part of this, we also announced that we'll be moving everything but the latest version of the provider behind an access kind of flag gate. And you need an Upbound paid subscription to access all the providers. So this is a reminder for users that the 3-month grace period that we announced is coming to an end at the end of January, when the enforcement will kick in. To help folks who are running, and wanting to try examples easily from the website, etc., to not have to wonder, which is the latest version that's available. We've introduced the vMajor version tag for these providers. So instead of having to know to install v1.18.3 or whatever, and then when v1.19 comes in to switch to that one, you can just tag it to v1, and that will always then pull in the latest version of the provider for you. I've linked to the blog post for the announcement, as well as the access policy in our documentation. And if folks have any questions on this, they can feel free to reach out in the Upbound channel in Crossplane Slack.
Cool. Thanks, John, for that reminder there and laying out some clear details about this upcoming impact. All right. So the next agenda item here is Nick. That's all yours. I think you do want to share your screen. Is that right? As you're talking through some exciting vision and direction for Crossplane.
Yes, please.
Okay, I stopped sharing mine. Should be up for you, bud.
Okay, and I need to please hold for a second while I get all the screens in the right place. Okay. Okay, you should now see me sharing a screen called the future of Crossplane.
Yep.
Should be pretty quick. I think this presentation's only like a couple of slides. So, recap of what Crossplane is today. I'm sure that if you're on this call, you know what Crossplane is today. It's my mouse cursor. So I think the main parts that people use with Crossplane are managed resources, the providers, the things that allow you to bring APIs that manage external cloud resources, AWS, Google, Azure, GitHub, GitLab, whatever, into your Kubernetes API. And then the composition layer on top of that allows you to build opinionated APIs that your developers, if you're a platform engineer, that your developers can use to self-service. I think, though, that it's safe to say that people mostly use this to manage infrastructure. They mostly use it to manage things like clusters and databases. People have come to think of Crossplane, for better or worse, as sort of like an infrastructure as code tools, sort of like a Terraform replacement that's Kubernetes native, maybe, or something that complements Terraform that's Kubernetes native. I think this way of thinking even, makes total sense because it's how we framed Crossplane for a long time. I think this diagram that I put together years and years ago still shows up on docs.crossplane.io, and this I think sort of helps explain why people think about Crossplane as an infrastructure tool. Here you can see that there's an application, and then the application creates so the application is external to Crossplane. Let's say it's a deployment or something like that, right? And then we say, okay, the application creates a claim, and the claim is, an API of your definition. So the claim in this case might be an Acme database or something like that, Acme cache. And then all the Crossplane stuff kicks in. There's a composite resource, and that composes managed resources using XRDs and compositions and whatnot. But I think the key thing to focus on here is note that the application is something that we say in this diagram lives outside of Crossplane. But why is that? And there's this interesting phenomenon that's been happening. I remember a great moment at the AWS Open Source Symposium in the Bay Area, like 2, possibly 3 years ago, quite a while ago, where I forget his name, unfortunately. I forget which person it was, but it was one of the founders of the Argo project who was at the time still working at Intuit. And someone asked his opinion on some particular application model. And his answer resonated strongly with me because it was exactly the way we thought about things with Crossplane, where he said, I don't think that one project out there is just going to invent an app model that works for everyone, and everyone's sort of going to say, oh, someone finally did it. This is the app model that works for everyone. Instead, each organization has to come up with an application model that sort of works for them. And, at the time I was like, yeah, of course, in the Crossplane world, I would say just use composition to build your app model. I think actually at this time, this was before we had functions, so the expressiveness of composition would have limited you from building an app model. But it's definitely possible today. I won't name names, but our head of product inside of Upbound recently rebuilt an entire popular open source app model just using compositions in Crossplane, just made the app model using compositions. So it's totally possible. So for maybe like 2 years now at conferences, and when people ask me what my opinion is about what app model should I put in front of Crossplane, Crossplane's for my infrastructure, what should I use for my apps? I've been saying to people, you should use Crossplane. You should use Crossplane for all of it. I don't see why you would use, something very similar to Crossplane as an abstraction layer in front of Crossplane. Why not standardize on one tool? But the question is that, and we started to ask myself this more seriously about a year ago inside of Upbound, and spark some conversations that have sort of led to this today. The question is Crossplane a good fit for this? And I would say today it's not an ideal fit for this. So Crossplane today for applications. So when I say for applications, all I'm saying is that instead of your claim being an RDS instance or something that an application consumes, imagine that your claim, the abstract APIs that you build with Crossplane represent the application itself. Say they're kind application, kind Acme application, kind, my web app, or whatever the specific application is, any of the above, whatever makes sense for your organization. I think the pros are all the same pros that we have, for managing infrastructure today. I think we have the most powerful and extensible composition engine in the industry, short of reaching for controller runtime and kube builder and doing it the advanced way with writing Go code. I think we're helped by the fact that we have a large library of providers and managed resources for infrastructure dependencies, even in a world where you raise the abstraction layer to be building APIs that represent apps. Those apps mostly still have what we consider infrastructure dependencies, databases, caches, things like that. So I think, your app is still probably going to be composed of those, as well as maybe Kubernetes deployments and services, or whatever, tool you use to actually deploy your workloads. So, Crossplane having a large pre-baked library of those helps a lot. And of course, I think, when it comes to tools that let you sort of roll your own API-based abstractions, I think, we're the most mature, largest community, most battle-tested of those things. Cons, though. We historically have said don't use arbitrary resources with Crossplane. It's because of cluster scoping, which is the second con that I think here. This becomes awkward, right? There is little bits of code in Crossplane that assume that everything that you compose is cluster scoped. And you can adapt to compose arbitrary resources. When I say arbitrary resources, I just mean composing something that's not a Crossplane resource. So that could be core resources like a Kubernetes deployment or a pod or a service, or it could be custom resources from other systems, so cluster API or Kubernetes config connector or whatever, right? Mostly, I think I haven't actually checked the numbers, but let's say 90% or 80% of custom resources within the Kubernetes ecosystem are namespaced and not cluster scoped, and Crossplane assumes that it will compose cluster scope things. So in order to use arbitrary resources, you need to use our provider Kubernetes, which is sort of like an adapter layer, and this sort of just creates a little bit of sort of bloat. And it's all possible today. It's just more awkward than I'd like. So I think this diagram sort of shows what it would look like today. Let's assume that I have a claim that represents an application. I want to go deploy some web app that is composed of a deployment to service at a database, an RDS instance. Today, my goal is to, in my team's namespace, create an application abstraction. And in that namespace, that should be rendered out to all the things that application composes of. So in this simple scenario, that should turn into a deployment of service in RDS instance. But using Crossplane today, what's going to happen is you're going to create your application claim, and then it's going to go and create a cluster scoped application composite resource, an XR. That's going to go create a cluster scoped RDS instance managed resource. It's also going to go create cluster scoped objects, and those are then going to be rendered into namespace scoped deployments and services. So it does the thing. You've achieved your goal, but it's a little awkward. Why are there these things at the cluster scope? Why are you sort of escaping the scope that you're trying to operate in? This means that if you want to go check on your team's RDS instances, you must be given RBAC permission to look at all RDS instances in the whole cluster at the cluster scope, regardless of whether they're related to things in your team's namespace or another team's namespace. It's just a little bit more awkward than I'd like for this use case. So I think this is kind of the what you actually probably want in this case, right? You probably want to create an abstraction. Let's ignore claims for now. Let's say you make your application composite resource and it's just namespaced, and it just turns into a namespace managed resource, and it turns into a namespace deployment and service. I think this is kind of the least surprising, the principle of least surprise for people who come from a Kubernetes background. I will make the point that provider Kubernetes and the object is very much the object type that provider Kubernetes gives you to wrap things is very much a trade-off. I could still imagine in this world potentially wanting to use provider Kubernetes. It has some benefits. Obviously, if you want to, provider Kubernetes was invented to let you go deploy things to a different Kubernetes cluster. So I think it's still useful for that. The other thing that it does is just normalizes things into a Crossplane managed resource. But what I mean by that is it makes sure that the object is always going to have Crossplane-like status conditions on it. It's going to have features like management policies. If there's ever a thing that if we ever have a feature that we want to roll out to all managed resources in the Crossplane ecosystem, that's going to be there on the Kubernetes object. But I think historically, we've basically said you must use these Kubernetes objects if you want to compose a deployment or service. You must use that extra layer of complexity and abstraction. I think in a better world, we'd say you may use it. If you see a benefit in it, it's there, but it's fine to not use it. So imagine a world in Crossplane where composite resources become namespaced mostly. What I mean by that is composite resources, same as the Kubernetes ecosystem. There's, 10, 15% of resources in the Kubernetes ecosystem. RBAC cluster roles are the first thing that always comes to mind, and I'm sure there's plenty of others. nodes, persistent volumes, etc., that kind of thing, that are cluster scoped. So I think this means that there is a probably a need for a cluster scoped abstraction to have a cluster scoped XR that composes those things. But I think that if we hadn't, if you wipe away the history of Crossplane and say we haven't existed, we came out today, I think intuitively most composite resources people would want to be namespaced. And the interesting thing here is if composite resources become namespaced mostly, if it's an edge case to create a cluster scope composite resource, then there's not really a reason to have claims anymore, right? You don't need the claim at the namespace to sync to the same thing at the cluster scope to, turn into a bunch of cluster scope stuff, right? I can go into more detail if people are interested in it as to why we made things cluster scoped. It felt like a good idea under the model we were going for at the time, but I think now with 5 years of hindsight, I don't agree with that decision anymore. That was my decision, so I don't agree with myself 5 years ago. I think it's important for managed resources to become namespaced under this new model. I think that there are sometimes advantages to managed resources being cluster scoped, but I don't think that they're huge. I think that it would be better overall if they were namespaced. Any managed resource that is actually part of an app, I think it makes sense for it to sit in a namespace with all of the other parts of that app, that be they, deployment services, etc. Managed resources that are shared infrastructure, like clusters or VPCs or things like that. At the time that we invented Crossplane, we interpreted the Kubernetes API guidelines as saying it's strictly forbidden to ever reference something in another namespace. Don't do it ever. It's since sort of the API conventions have been updated to be like, there are dragons here and you should be very careful if you do it, but it's okay if you do this and this and that. So I could imagine a world where we just say, yeah, if you have a cluster or something that's shared team infrastructure, put it in a shared infrastructure namespace, and it's fine for people to reference that across namespaces. So a better Crossplane, XRs become namespaced mostly. Let's say 90% of XRs became namespaced. All managed resources become namespaced. We support composing arbitrary resources, which just means we stop having an opinion about, do you need to only use Crossplane composition with managed resources? You're fine to use it with deployments. And finally, we say it's okay to use only parts of Crossplane. I think of this as there's sort of two ways that you can look at the world, right? With regards to a tool like Crossplane that has a couple of different components. We've historically had what I would think of as like a vertically integrated stack, where we say we don't design for you to use managed resources by themselves. That's not something that we support. We don't design for you to use composition by itself without managed resources. You should use it all together. I think we basically relax that a little bit and just say, it's fine if you have it. Realistically, people are doing this already, so I think we just lean into it and say it's fine if you just want to use managed resources and you want to use managed resources just by themselves with no abstraction layer, or you want to put them in a Helm chart, or you want to use them with some other composition tool that you prefer, or you want to build a controller around them. It's fine. It's valid. We're not going to tell you not to do that. And similarly, if you want to use the Crossplane composition layer and not use any providers, not use managed resources, and just use deployments, or just use Kubernetes config connector or whatever, fine. You can do that. Jason, I see your hand up. I've got like 2 or 3 more slides, and then I'll jump in. So assume that we want to go in this direction, and we definitely want your feedback as to whether this is the direction that we want to go. I think there's a couple of different ways that we could get there, right? One of the things that's challenging is that changing stuff from cluster scope to namespace is pretty disruptive, right? And we don't want to disrupt our community. So one option is purely additive changes. So we add knobs to Crossplane. You imagine, for example, for XRs, we add a scope field to the XRD that defaults to cluster scope, and you can then set it to namespaced. That's at one end. I'll jump to the other one. The option 3 is Crossplane v2 with a bunch of breaking API changes. And in the middle, maybe we add changes, then we make breaking changes over time to sort of get here. This is something that's still very much up for discussion and debate, and we need to. I think what I'm trying to balance here is finding a way to finding a path to get to the vision that we outline that breaks existing users not at all, or as little as possible, but avoids bringing over a lot of our historical baggage into our goal. Like, I would love us to find a path that is the least painful possible for people who are using Crossplane today, but also results in the simplest possible crossplane that doesn't have a lot of sort of deprecated concepts and bad defaults and things like that in future. So I think there's kind of pros and cons of either of these. The purely additive changes approach looks like, we add a new scope field for XRDs that, says that you get cluster or namespaced. Maybe we add a scope flag to providers, and when you install a provider, you get to choose whether the MRs show up as namespace scoped or cluster scoped or both at the same time. But in this world, this adds more complexity. If assuming that, for example, forever, you can, until the end of time, you can choose whether provider manage resources, cluster scope, namespace, or both. That's, one thing that Crossplane users have to load up mental state wise. When learning Crossplane, that's one thing we have to factor in when building new features. The more complexity you've got, the harder it is to kind of extend the system. So, this is the least disruptive option, but it's also kind of the most baggage brought forward to Crossplane. Series of smaller breaking changes is kind of the additive changes option, but over time, we add a new scope field for XRDs, and then we say the default is cluster scoped, and then eventually we change the default to namespace. So this is like breaking changes for users, but they get sort of broken up into smaller breaking changes. And finally, the potentially most disruptive option, depending on how we do it, is we say there's a new Crossplane v2. Maybe the Crossplane v2 can be installed side by side with v1, so that there's a path or a period where you can run both to sort of migrate to the new version, and new users just pick up Crossplane v2 and don't have to worry about Crossplane v1, etc. Maybe there's also an option where Crossplane v2 can keep the v1 APIs, and we use different CRD API versions to accommodate this. The only nuance there is, unfortunately, you cannot make a custom resource go from cluster scoped to namespace scoped or vice versa by just adding a new version of the CRD. So for instance, the RDS instance managed resource, we can't just add RDS v3 or whatever and say, hey, this is namespace scoped now. That is a limitation of Kubernetes. So those are the options that are coming to mind. I want to be very clear, nothing at all is set in stone here. Like, this is the beginning of a conversation with the community and users of Crossplane as to is this even something that people are excited about? Is this something that people think we should do? So these goals of effectively the big headline changes, I think, would be moving to more of a namespace scope and more compatibility with arbitrary resources. Is that something that people want? And then, if we agree that by and large, this is something that the community actually wants from Crossplane, then I think the next step is, how do we get there? How do we get ourselves from where we are today to this new version of Crossplane, or this new sort of vision of Crossplane, without harming existing users, and while also sort of streamlining and keeping Crossplane, like, not making it harder to use for newcomers. That is the end of my presentation. Jason, you had your hand up before. Did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah. Sorry. Great presentation, by the way. Great stuff. Very excited. So I'm thumbs up. But when you talk about namespace scope, is provider config something that we'd probably be namespace scoped as well? So like if you had multiple accounts in Google or Amazon or whatever, they'd all be namespace scoped and isolated?
That's a good question. We, in the very early days of Crossplane, we maybe both. Like, I think I would prefer to avoid cases where we have like X and cluster X unless we really need it. And I think the provider configs might be one of those, right, where we actually need a namespace variant and a cluster scoped variant.
Sure.
They almost feel like they would make more sense as a namespace scope variant. The one problem we've had with namespace scope things for something like this before is you end up with a chicken and egg when provisioning a new cluster. You've got to make sure all your namespaces exist, and then when you create a namespace, you've got to drop a provider config into them before anyone can use managed resources in their namespace.
Yep.
Maybe both.
You have the bootstrap problem.
Yeah. Again, this is a lot of this is like, we've been talking about this inside of Upbound, not constantly, but like on and off for about a year. So there's many different iterations of our thinking before we've sort of brought it public today, and none of them are set in stone. So But the latest sketch I had, I think, if I recall correctly, because I just came back from 2 weeks of vacation, had provider config being kind of available on both.
Okay. I think personally, from my perspective, namespace scoped is a massive benefit for provider configs. I
Nice.
think, anyway.
Cool, that's good to know. Christian, I see you've got your hand up. Oh. Christian disappeared. Oh no, there he is. Although I can't hear you, Christian, if you are speaking. Ah. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions while Christian works on his mic? All right. No worries, Christian. Thanks for letting us know. Braden.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I'm new still at Crossplane, but one of the things that I saw as a sort of benefit is that because we get to put these opinionated interfaces in place, and the MRs are sort of cluster scoped, that it means that a developer that maybe has free reign within their namespace can only make the things that the interface says. So if we move the MRs up to namespace scoped, do you think that we will need some sort of policy engine sort of thing to say you can or cannot make various types of resources just with roles and role binding kind of things, or Governo or whatever? Is that sort of the vision you're seeing, to keep it from, well, now I have a namespace scoped MR for making an RDS instance, and now this developer made 30 of them in their namespace, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a really interesting scenario for me, because I'm now making the opposite argument I've been making for years and years, and I actually think the cluster scoped argument is that I have been making myself is kind of weak. So cluster scope as a way to sort of separate concerns, to say namespace scoped is the stuff that is the application developer's concern, and cluster scope stuff is the platform operator's concern, is kind of really just RBAC, right? All you've said is you do not have RBAC access to access this type at the cluster scope. And I believe you could just as easily say you do not have RBAC access to access this type at the namespace scope. But I think it's not as simple as like do not access as in you can't see it at all, right? I've sort of advised people historically, there's two options when you build these abstractions, right? The abstraction, the my company's app or whatever, or my company's database, whatever your XR is, that turns into concrete resources. And I think that as a platform team, there's two ways you can go about deciding what happens with regards to user access to the concrete resources that gets rendered out to, right? The hard way, it's almost like the North Star. But it is a lot more work. Is to say your users can only see the application. They can only see the abstraction. They cannot actually see what it turns into, right? This is sort of like trying to be a cloud provider. This is like if I go to Amazon and I ask for an RDS instance. I've never worked at Amazon, so I don't actually know what happens behind the scenes, but I imagine that there's maybe VMs and things like that power that RDS instance. But Amazon doesn't show that to you, to the developer. They create a hard abstraction that you can't see what's going on behind. They can do that because they have put a ton of effort and automation into it. They have a ton of staffing for support and operations and things like that, right? So if something goes wrong with something behind that abstraction, they have the sort of contract of like, we'll take care of that for you. You don't have to worry about it. If you're a platform team at anything apart from a huge mega corporation, you probably don't have that amount of bandwidth. So, and I've come from like 15 years of platform teams, coming from Google's to Spotify to like 50-person startups. I would advise people, you should probably give your users read-only access to see the things behind the abstraction. So in this case, if I'm deploying an app and the app turns into a deployment in a service in an RDS instance, I would recommend that your users should see the deployment and service and RDS instances. They probably shouldn't have RBAC access to directly modify them, but they should be able to see what they are. And this just helps them help themselves. If something gets stuck or they need to troubleshoot or they need to contact you and say, hey, my RDS instance isn't working, they can say, hey, my RDS instance isn't working, and like, I see it's giving me this error or something. So it just makes life easier for you as a platform team to give users the option of looking at stuff, right? So with all that context in place, if you assume that in many cases or in most cases you're going to have an abstraction that is namespaced and it's going to render out to read-only resources that are, from the user's perspective, read-only resources that they logically consider part of their application, I think it makes sense for those to be in the same namespace and for the user to just have no RBAC access to edit them, to just view them. Or again, put them in the namespace and just don't give them RBAC access at all if you really want to aim for that, panacea of like the user doesn't get to see at all what's behind the scenes. Does that make sense, Brad?
Yeah, it does. Actually, as I was asking the question, I started realizing that our model is just the lazy way of, I just do a role binding to the admin cluster role within the namespace. And like, that's like, okay, well, that's just a star allow list. But if we wanted to do this right, we would just say, no, developers have their own role and it's this is the allow list. You can do these things. If
Right.
it is, then it all makes sense, actually. So just bad practices trickling down.
Yeah, it's for a long time I sort of made the case that the cluster scope helps with the separation of concerns, and I think once you realize that it's kind of just RBAC, I think the only small advantage you have from cluster scope is that you don't have to figure out what namespace the things are in, but you can pretty easily do kubectl -- all namespaces, get RDS instances or whatever, and it's going to show you all of them across all namespaces or whatever type you're looking for. All right, give me a second to read what Christian said here. Yeah, I think so. If I'm following correctly, you're saying, oh, all right. Let me address the second one because that's easier. Yeah, the way that Istio does their cluster scope by having a cluster scope namespace Istio system, that is actually the way that Crossplane worked before I convinced us to change to cluster scope. So, so that's I don't know if I'd recommend. I think for Istio that makes sense. For Crossplane, where the cluster scope stuff might be less coupled to like the workings of Crossplane and more like infrastructure that is shared, I might say call the namespace shared infrastructure or networking or whatever, but it's kind of up to you. Like so there is a way to kind of reference MRs from multiple claims and compositions that was added relatively recently with regard to just loading data from it. So you can use a composition function pipeline to say, usually when composition is happening, Crossplane says, sends to your function, it says, here's the XR, here's the abstraction, and here's all the things it's made of. A community member, Dalton, recently added a feature where your function can then respond and say, I need these other things as well, please give me these managed resources that are not directly related to me. And Crossplane will fetch those and send them to your function and run it again and say, okay, here they are, is that what you needed? So this helps with regards to just loading data from resources that aren't part of the managed resource, but it does not do reference counting and or order of creation and things like that. We do have so something that I'm pretty reluctant to do is try to build a DAG into Kubernetes where there is actually like an understanding of the order of all these objects and their relationships with each other, especially if that DAG expands outside the composition and starts to sort of be just a DAG of every object that Crossplane knows of to sort of help with ordering and deletion, things like that. There are benefits to the loose coupling in Kubernetes and Crossplane, although, as you point out, one of the downsides is more reconciles than is necessary to make things work. We do have some middle ground solutions. There are the usage type that you can basically create to say this thing uses that, so don't let this thing be deleted before that is deleted, or vice versa. Hassan, who's on the call here, also created, forget the name of the function, Hassan, but one that lets you sort of artificially influence the creation order of things. So
I think it's function sequencer.
So that's it, yeah. So there's some things that kind of sort of help there, but there's not like a full-on graph that we're creating to be able to strictly know that we shouldn't take this operation before we take that operation. Yeah, I'm pretty reluctant to try and build that into the Crossplane, but I can kind of see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, actually, I was the way we were thinking about it was just having, because I think on each MR you have a list at the bottom that says who's referencing that object. So, and it's a list, but we only put one entry in there. So I was thinking that maybe just having that list get updated and have multiple entries for whoever's referencing that object, and not delete that if there's still entries in there. But I can understand the complexity. It's just it's a, let's say it's a dream that we have to have that feature, but it's not the end of the world either.
Yeah. When you say the list, are you talking about owner references by any chance? Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Would you mind writing up that request as a GitHub issue? I can't make any promises, but maybe it would be okay if we notice that something is referencing a managed resource to go and add a owner reference to it. Not sure. Need to think about it, but yeah, if you wouldn't mind writing that up as a feature request on Crossplane/Crossplane, we can think about it.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, Braden, so the sequencer gets you a sort of a mini DAG for creation. I think for deletion, it's a different feature called usages that you can use to somewhat order the deletion. Oh, it's not, perhaps not ordering is a right way to say it, but there's a way to say don't delete this because this thing is already using it. So, the dependent must be deleted first before the dependency is deleted. And I think that there's a plan to promote that to beta or GA. I forget where it's at the moment in the next Crossplane release. All right. Any other thoughts or questions on this topic?
I find it a really interesting subject. I've just been rethinking the way we are deploying our current applications, which are basically just Kubernetes applications that also happen to use some cloud resources. So thinking about it in this way, as in like dropping Helm, for instance, as a templating engine, and doing everything with the templating engine we choose for inside the Crossplane. It's a new way of thinking, and I like it. I'm gonna exercise it a lot this week. And my main concern would be the migration, especially if you are dropping claims. Like we are currently really promoting the use of claims. We've gone through a lot of effort of making the managed resources visible in Argo CD, stuff like that. I think for us, our main concern is if we migrate to something like that, and we have to tell our teams to stop using a claim. That step would have to be easy also for moving the managed resources from the cluster scope to the namespaces. We've had quite a few issues with managed resources that are fighting over each other's attention, where we see the reconciliation of Crossplane coming by like every second because someone forgot, or Argo CD basically forgot to remove a composite resource.
Yeah, I think despite claims going away, if you think about what a claim is, it's kind of a namespaced XR, right? Like claims are a proxy for an XR that has all of the same schemas. So by and large, there's a few bits of crossplane machinery in there that change, but so my hope is that from a user's perspective, a namespaced XR looks the same as a claim. And my preference at the moment would be to somehow at some point deprecate and remove claims as a concept. Part of when I started looking at this, in addition to looking at applications, something I personally noticed was that if you read people's feedback on Crossplane, we follow all the Reddit threads where people are giving feedback on Crossplane, right? And something that I personally have noticed is that even when people really like Crossplane and they really try to sell it to other people, it's always prefaced with, okay, this thing is super complicated and it's going to take you forever to understand it, but once you get through all of that, it's a really great tool, right? So what I started trying to take a critical eye at is, more concepts make things more complicated. What can we drop, right? If we were to remove things, what could we get rid of to make this a simpler system? And so I have a bias for, if you could have a namespace XR, my preference would be to remove claims so that there's just one fewer concept, one fewer moving part, or one less moving part in Crossplane that new users have to learn about. It's just one thing, but it's pretty front and center. And I would sort of love to be looking at, are there ways that we can simplify Crossplane? Now, the other side of that coin that makes it really challenging is that anytime you want to deprecate or remove a feature, there's going to be someone out there who really likes that feature and who wants it there. So it's a challenging thing to do. We may not ever be able to do it, but I am trying to look at, if we're looking at the future of Crossplane, and we're especially trying to make Crossplane more useful to more people, break out of just the infrastructure space, get into applications. Or another way to say it is just, if you want to build API abstractions for anything cloudy, software-y, Crossplane's good for that, whether it's an app and infrastructure, both, like, less opinionated. I'd love to do whatever I can to sort of simplify and streamline Crossplane. Jason, you've got your hand up again?
Yeah. Yeah. So there may be a value in keeping claims on, but turning them into, like, kind of behind the scenes, making them optional, making them behave like the namespace XRs for, let's say, outward compatibility of people that have prior art and stuff already built. Like, people have stuff built already into assuming that claims exist. So keeping them and just making them like be a superficial thing that gets you into the namespace may be harmless for a while as an optional feature, but it will help it'll help backward compatibility potentially. The second question I had is, or the question I had is, do you have a time frame for how many releases out this is? Or I guess you probably don't, but I'm just wondering, like, what's the order of operations of what's next, and how can we get involved?
Yeah, we do not have a time frame. Step one was to get an idea of, is the community excited about this? So the next step is, well, this is maybe step 0, right? The next step is I'm going to take broadly what I've put in this presentation, and I'm going to put that in a slightly more detailed document that we can circulate asynchronously to get feedback, because obviously, not everyone comes to these community meetings, so we want to get this out to a larger audience. Once that's done, I think it is going to be a case of the next steps after that are going to, be variable based on how the community feels and what the community thinks about where we'll go. A lot of it is going to come down to, like, do we think we can do this in an incremental way that is backward compatible, or do we think that this requires a new version of Crossplane that would be a bigger breaking change, right? There was an idea that actually only came up this morning that is pretty appealing to me at the moment as just a hand wavy sketch. But imagine we ship a Crossplane v2.0.0. It has new v2 versions of the XRD API, and in the v2 version of the XRD API, XRs have a scope field that default to namespaced. They don't support claims, but in the v1 version, it defaults to cluster scoped and claims are supported. I think that this would be possible to cover XRs. The v2, we could use this to also make some breaking changes that might be sort of less impactful to people. I would love to have an opportunity at some point to drop things like the deletion policy field that's been deprecated forever in favor of management policies, to drop native patch and transform from Crossplane. Like, I would really love to avoid having to carry that complexity and baggage forever into the future. It's been marked deprecated for a couple of releases now. I will say every option we've looked at so far, the biggest pain point for existing Crossplane users is going to be if you assume that cluster scoped managed resources won't be available forever, that at some point we are going to say, okay, managed resources are namespaced and there is no cluster scoped option anymore. then that means all managed resources must be recreated because you cannot just have a new version of that API. So that's where I think the biggest pain is going to be. So figuring out what to do about that is probably one of the biggest things that we're going to have to focus on. All right. Shall we wrap this topic up, and we can, I'm Negs NEGZ on Slack, so feel free to DM me on Slack if you have any thoughts that you want to share. We don't have like a channel for this or anything like that yet, but maybe we will at some point.
Awesome, Nick. Thanks for walking us through all that, all those ideas, and kind of exploring it together as a group today. There's a couple other optional time topics that Christian brought up. So I think we're at the end of the mainline agenda and at the top of the hour as well. So folks, want to or need to go take off to other obligations, that's fine. But if folks want to stick around a little bit for some optional discussion time here, then Christian, the floor is yours for anything you wanted to bring up specifically about these issues that you've linked here.
Awesome. So I don't have anything to share, but basically, yeah, the first point is one use case we have right now is we do a lot of custom functions in Go, and we create a lot of MRs based on a claim. And a lot of times we don't know what kind, like how many objects we're going to create of each type. And so sometimes we need to most of the time we need to sequence how we're going to create our objects. But since we don't know beforehand which types, what names we're going to create and all that stuff, we can't really use the function sequencer to sequence that for us. So we end up having to sequence that ourselves in the code, and it's really messy and it's really hard to test, very annoying. So one thing I would have liked was to use the function sequencer, but to do so would mean I would have to dynamically send an input to that function so that it knows which objects to create first and what next and all that stuff. But currently it's impossible. And the only way that could work is if function sequencer would implement some kind of custom input where it would read from an environment config or something like that. I was looking around and I actually created an issue in function sequencer repo, but then I found this proposal that's been created in August 2024, and it kind of looks like it could fill that missing feature gap, I would say. Basically, it's like a generic way of giving input from one function to another, and it could be pretty interesting to have. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw it out there and see if other people are interested, and if I don't know if the Crossplane community wants to go forward with that.
Yeah, I think Bob was driving this one, right? He opened this issue and was started thinking about the idea here. I see like the use case here, but I haven't caught up fully, and I wasn't fully bought in either on like the proposed UX for it either. So I think that there would certainly be some effort to undergo to kind of get to a experience that is has good ergonomics to it and is something that we can is maintainable, etc. too. But I think this has a fair amount of work to get to a something usable on it though.
Yeah, for sure. I mean the main, like the way I was seeing it was we could just have some kind of input that would tell the function, hey, go get your actual input from this key in the environment config, and then it could read that from there as it would read a normal input. But yeah, that way it could really simplify our own custom functions. We could just basically define all of the objects, whether they're valid or not, and we basically trust that the function sequencer would create them in the right order, and that wouldn't cause any issues, and it would really, really simplify the tests on our side. for our functions. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the big challenge with this proposal is any proposal that we have, if you scroll down a little bit, Jared, just a few lines that you can see, sorry, to the end of the main body of the comment. Yeah, you can see it's the sort of, there was a sketch of the possible like input refs of, spec.parameters of foo. Something I've sort of come to believe is that anytime we have something like this, it becomes a strong risk of turning into the patch and transform API, right? Because it starts out simple of, hey, just get this value from this field in the XR, please, and then it turns into, oh, I actually need to take that value and reverse it, or make it all caps, or concatenate it with this other value, or grow patch and transform again in other places of the API. So that's kind of the big challenge. There's, we could go look at Cell or something like that instead, but I'm not personally convinced that that's really, much better or different. So that's kind of the big challenge there. But I didn't quite follow it. Is it important to you that it loads this from the XR and environment config? Because if you just want to load it from your function, you could use, so if you've got your function and then you want to use functions, could you use the function context to pass that, the blob of just arbitrary data that gets passed down the pipeline?
If I own both functions, I think it would be possible, but I don't. I mean, function sequencer is the open source version, and my custom function is my own. So function sequencer can't know which key to grab, and
yeah, I'm
that's
just
basically it.
Where my mind was going is I wonder if we could teach function sequencer to optionally take input from a context key as well, or something like that.
Yeah, well, that's basically what I was kind of suggesting here, is just having a standard way of telling functions to grab their own input from a specific key, so that it would work for any function,
Got it. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. If there was basically some kind of standard key in the context that overrode the input for a future function.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems like an interesting idea to me. I wonder if there'd be any security issues if, an arbitrary function could, I guess not, because you kind of own all the functions you put in your pipeline anyway, but I could imagine there'd be some confusing possible things if, if you've got an input.
Yeah.
You can see on the composition and then dynamic input somewhere else as well. But I guess.
Yeah, I think it would have to be like an explicit in the composition. You would tell the function, hey, go grab your input from that key specifically, rather than overriding an input that you already put in the composition.
Yeah, I like that idea. Do you want to go write that one up as a GitHub issue as well? That would be appreciated.
I thought that this actual issue was basically that. I don't know if maybe I'm mistaken, but my last comment. See, that's my comment. The last one.
Oh, got it. I see. Yeah, it's definitely a slightly different thing than I think what Bob was originally proposing, but yeah, it's probably close enough that we don't need a new one. Okay, I'll put a sketch of I think what we were just talking about as a comment on this issue after the meeting.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And the second issue basically was I already talked about it in the previous meeting, I think, but basically, one thing we've realized is that every time we restart any provider pod, it basically reconciles every single managed resource, which is not only inefficient, but also causes issues with rate limiting from cloud providers and all that stuff. So I think that one thing we implemented on our side was just basically saving the last time we successfully reconciled externally, and then if we restart, we just basically check is the current time past the sync time, I believe, or was it, I don't know, I forgot. There's like two settings in providers where it's either the sync time or the whatever other time, I forgot. But if it's past that time since the last successful external reconcile, then we actually reconcile. Otherwise, we just assume that everything is fine and pass to the next object. That way we don't do external calls. I think it's something that could benefit basically everyone. I don't know. I'm actually surprised no one else has commented on that, because I mean, the issue with the rate limiting happens very, very quickly. As soon as you restart, like, you know, you update your providers or whatever, then it starts reconciling everything. And if you have like thousands of objects, it's basically rate limits instantly. So I was wondering if anyone else has this issue, and if anyone else is interested also in having that fixed. I think you're muted, Nick.
Yeah, I certainly know that rate limiting in general is something that people, you know, comment on frequently. Specifically, the rate limiting at the restart of a provider. I haven't seen too, you know, I believe I agree with you that it's impacting people. I haven't seen too many people specifically bring that up though. But so it sounds like you've got something that is working for you, that's sort of tested in your environment, right? So if that is the case, I'd certainly be I'd certainly be open to taking this to like a one-pager or something like that that sort of proposes a set of changes that we could make. And I'm not sure if we're gonna have time, but if something you'd be interested in contributing, then potentially be open to that.
Yeah, I'm not against contributing for sure. So yeah, you actually commented. I just saw you actually commented on that issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically the main concern was just the way it would be implemented. But I think the idea behind is like fairly. I think everyone is like kind of okay with the general idea. It's just the way of implementing that was not exactly. I mean, I did it in a hacky way because I just wanted to get something done fast.
Yeah.
But for sure, if we do it in Crossplane, it has to be something much better.
Yeah, but we're certainly you know, if it's something that you already have done some experimentation on or you're passionate about, we certainly really appreciate having you know, you sort of drive that feature forward.
So how would that work? Basically, what are the next steps?
Next step is usually to we've got like a design Crossplane repo. Next step would be to sort of take what's in a one page, like a small design doc. I think there's a template in there.
Okay.
Most of our one pages end up being pretty long, but they can, you know, it's succinctly welcome to. But I think that's just what we would use to specifically they would go, all that kind of, you know, how the controllers would behave, etc. And once that gets approved, then it's just a case of going and implementing it in Crossplane on time.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for continuing to drive those needs, Christian, that you're seeing in your environment, you know, representing other community members that might be seeing the same thing. That's always appreciated, man.
Thank you very much, guys.
All right, so that's everything on the agenda doc here. So I think we can go ahead and adjourn for this meeting here. Thanks again, Nick, for walking us through some exciting stuff for future Crossplane activity. Thanks everybody for engaging and sharing ideas. And there's definitely going to be some more discussion and opportunities for folks to get involved there. So yeah, great to see everybody today. Thanks for stopping by. See y'all next time.